Good day again, students. I think this is lecture 9, and we are now entering a radically new period of Western European thought. This lecture begins the topic 4, the topic on the modern world. We have dealt with antiquity. The age of antiquity would be the age of the Greeks and Romans. Medieval period, the medieval period would be from 500 to 1500 AD, the period in Western Europe when we first had the collapse of the Western Empire, the Dark Ages in the West, and then the rise of modern European nations. By 1500, we had, to a large extent, the modern European nations had taken shape. Not all of them had achieved full political unification. Germany and Italy had not achieved that. Spain was in the process of achieving that. But there was some measure of national identity, very similar to what we are seeing today. So the modern world began from about the 15th century. Again, what I want to do is to provide you with an insight into the historical background, because developments in thought are virtually unintelligible unless you understand the historical background against which they developed. The historical background of the birth of modernity is one which witnessed a tremendous number of fundamental changes to human civilization, not just to Western civilization, but to human civilization. And the birth of the modern world in Western Europe was extremely significant because it led to what we are now experiencing today. There's an unbroken continuity between that period when Europe was virtually reborn and the modern world took shape, and the contemporary period of contemporary modernity, that is, the contemporary period of globalization. So there's a sense in which from the period of modernity, this early period of modernity, there's a kind of unbroken continuity in the development of civilization, first Western civilization, and subsequently human civilization. And there are a number of things that occasioned that, a number of things that were responsible for the development of fundamentally new social, cultural, and economic conditions in Western Europe that radically altered the quality of life. The first that I want to mention is the fall of Constantinople in around 1450. As you know, Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire. Rome had long been supplanted, and the West had experienced not only the Dark Ages, the fall of the Western systems of government, but radically new changes had taken place in the West that to a large extent radically separated the history of the what was the Western Empire, the remains of the Western Empire, and the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire maintained its integrity, its sovereignty, its independence. It always had an emperor. The church was still extremely important in the Eastern Empire, but the church should not override the state. The church was headed by the patriarch, the Western church by the Pope, the Eastern church by the patriarch. And to a large extent, the great thinkers and theologians of the Christian church lived in Constantinople and lived in the Greek-speaking world. That was the center still of the Greek-speaking world. Today we refer to it as Greek Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox faith. But Constantinople fell to the Turks in the middle of the 15th century. And the Turks are not Christians, the Turks are Muslim. And it was the first time that Constantinople was really seriously threatened. It had been attacked before by a number of Asiatic tribes and so on, but it was the first time that it already collapsed and succumbed to the military might of the Turkish armies. The Turkish people came from somewhere in Middle Europe, on Turkestan and these places, and they overpowered the West and transformed the state into an Islamic state. The greatest cathedral in the world existed in Constantinople. The Hagia Sophia, I think just recently, there have been a lot of discussion and debates over the status of the Hagia Sophia. I think even what is happening today is that there's an attempted restoration of the church because it was originally the leading Christian church in the world, not the Vatican, but the Hagia Sophia. And it was now transformed into a mosque. The Christians decided to take flight. A lot of the Christian scholars left Constantinople and they came to the West, and clearly the West that they were heading for was mainly the Italian city-states. So places like Milan and Florence and Venice and so on received a lot of these tremendous scholars who were not only coming with their knowledge, but they were coming with very, very important documents that the West did not have access to before. And so the arrival in the West led to a radical kind of intellectual ferment. New knowledge was coming, new ideas. A lot of the Greek past, right, the past of Greek civilization, still in the hands of the people of Constantinople, had not really been accessible to many of the Christian scholars in the West. Now they became accessible. And so there was a sense, especially emanating from the city of Florence, there was a sense that new things were happening, that there was a revival, a rebirth of civilization, a rebirth of learning and knowledge. And the period is very often referred to as the Renaissance period. Renaissance, the French word for rebirth. The Renaissance period was, and indeed, a very significant period in human history, certainly in Western history. And it is the Renaissance period that marks what is considered to be the beginning of Western modernity, of the Western modern world. Florence became a center of cultural and intellectual activity. A tremendous amount of scholarship was now emerging from Florence. Florence was able to attract some of the greatest engineers and writers and thinkers and poets and artists. Right? In Florence, for example, you had men like Michelangelo working on the big cathedrals, the Duomo. Right, that was one of his achievements. You had men like Leonardo da Vinci, right, painting, some of his tremendous works of art in Florence, and in fact, working for the prince, the Florentine prince. He was an engineer. He was a scholar. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci is perhaps the most talented human being who ever lived. Right, he was a number of things. He was a medical doctor, he was a poet, he was a philosopher, he was an architect, he was an engineer who had devised and drawn up models for things like flying saucers and submarines and so on. A tremendous achievement, and all of that was happening in the Italian cities. Later on, that sparked a kind of awakening in other European countries in Northern Europe, especially places like Holland, which was unique within the European countries, in that Holland was one of the only places in which you could enjoy a measure of intellectual freedom, see what you wanted, write what you wanted, and nobody would persecute you. So here you had a lot of activity taking place, and there was that sense that Europe had achieved, had got a new kind of inoculation, a revival, a rebirth. And you can find it, developing in all kinds of areas. In addition to that, simultaneous to the fall of Constantinople and the flight of the scholars to the West, we have the tremendous Copernican revolution that took place. Copernicus came up with a cosmological theory that radically shook the foundations of the Western worldview. And I should say the Judeo-Christian worldview. The notion of the cosmos was one in which the earth was at the center, right? It was a geocentric universe. The earth was at the center. Man was very important. Human beings, right, were the apple of God's eye, if you wish. Man was extremely important. And the universe was really circling around us. There was the old Ptolemaic system, in which you had the fixed stars circling the earth, and you had the planetary bodies making some strange movements, wandering movements in the heavens, which had to be explained, right, in terms of the theory of the spheres. In fact, many of the ancients believed that these spheres were propelled by angels. And then Copernicus came up with a radically different theory, and that is that no, the sun is at the center of the cosmos, and the earth is merely another planet, like those wandering planets like Venus and Mercury and Jupiter and Mars, and that the earth is moving around the sun. So that was a radical concept, radically different. It undermined the conventional view of the universe that God had created, in which he had put man at the center. The Copernican view was a view that initially was totally rejected, but when many of the modern scientists began to theorize it, they realized that it made far more sense that the complex Ptolemaic system that existed before, one that had to use all kinds of strange mathematics to explain the movement of the heavenly bodies. Now things could be explained much more simply. And Johann Kepler came up with laws of planetary motion, where he explained the movement of the heavenly bodies. The traditional view, right, was that the heavenly bodies moved in a circular manner. Kepler was able to show that that is not really so, right? That there's a sort of oblong shape of the movement of the course of the heavenly bodies. And so Kepler's ideas were substantiated by discoveries and inventions that were made by many of the other thinkers. So Galileo had been able to make significant progress in the development of the telescope. So for the first time, people could actually see the heavenly bodies close up. They could identify objects, right, in the heavenly bodies, like in the moon, for example. Galileo was able to see the moon and to see some of the geographical features of the surface of the moon. When he talked about that, well, people became angry because the moon was supposed to be a sacred object, a heavenly body that God put there to provide light to the earth. And Galileo was able to show that the moon is merely another planet like any other planet. At least it is the moon of our planet. And Galileo was brought before the Inquisition, right? The Inquisition, the Catholic Inquisition, pulled him up. He was Italian, so he was clearly in a very dangerous area when he was announcing his new discoveries. And he had to repudiate and renounce his position to survive. But it was a position that held. In fact, in the year that Galileo died, Isaac Newton was born. And after Isaac Newton, everything changed. The notions of the heavens radically, the notions of the cosmos radically changed. What Newton had done, in fact, Newton is considered to be the greatest scientist who ever lived. And what he had done is that he had laid the foundations for a scientific understanding of the nature of reality. Newton tried to explain the phenomenon of gravitation, or gravity, right? And he explained it in mathematical terms. I'm not going to go into that, but he used what is called the inverse square law. And you can look that up. Those of you who are mathematically bent would better be able to understand what he's saying there. The inverse square law explains why things fall to the earth. The law of gravity not only explains why objects, when they are thrown up in the air, fall to the earth, or why we are able to stay on the earth and not lift off into the air, or be hurled outside of the atmosphere of our planet, but it also explained how the heavenly bodies are moving. It provided the mathematical principles to explain all of activity and all motion in the universe. And then he came up with his 4 laws of motion, right? Very famous laws. And he made a tremendous discoveries in the area of optics. Optics is the science of light. So Newton, after Newton had publicized his ideas, his new ideas, his radically revolutionary concept of the world and of nature and of the universe, the notion of the universe operating by natural law became a fundamental idea that could not be resisted. And the universe is really a universe which can be explained in terms of natural law. And that has remained so, even though modern science has shifted slightly from the Newtonian position, right? And in modern times, after Albert Einstein and so on, we've had to sort of revise some of Newton's doctrines and concepts. But the Newtonian notion of the universe as a universe that is guided by natural law has become fundamental to the development and the growth of science. And in fact, we not only try to use laws to explain the natural world, but a number of thinkers, as we'll discover later on, have tried to use laws to explain the social world. And then there's the age of discovery. Very important. That in itself, just the experience from the travels of Western, of European sailors and so on all over the world, just from their travels, a radical new concept of the world had now taken shape. No longer could people really believe that the world was flat. The concept of the sphericity of the earth is something going back to the Greeks, but that never was a popular idea. When people talked about the circle of the earth, they really meant a circle like a coin, a flat surface, right? And the concept of the sphericity of the earth seemed to have been a strange theoretical concept that defied the light of natural reason. But now, the discoveries that were made provided full evidence that the world was really a sphere. First of all, we had the great discoveries of the Portuguese. The Portuguese were the ones who started that age of discovery, but they were sailing southward from Portugal along the western coast of Africa. And eventually they were able to tip the Cape Horn and head into the Indian Ocean. The search for a passage to India was a desperate search by Western Europe. India was known since the days of the Greeks, and there was a lot of traffic and so on within the Greek world, and even up to the time of the Roman Empire, still a fair amount of traffic between the East and the West. Goods could be obtained from India and so on. Now, with the rise of Islam, that route was cut off. All of that territory was now controlled by Islamic military and political forces. And so the West was cut off from the East almost entirely. There was no way in which you could penetrate because Islam was the leading power of the day, right? Their power was almost irremovable, indisputable. As I said in the last lecture, Baghdad was the capital of the world. And Islam spread from Morocco in Africa right across to China. So there's a sense in which there were economic motivations for the discoveries. There was the Europeans wanted to break out of the prison that they were held in by Islamic powers in North Africa and Western Asia. To break out of that prison, they had to sail. And the Portuguese have been able to round the Cape of Good Hope and reach India eventually. But simultaneous with that, the Spaniards, who were rivals of the Portuguese, were able to make their own discoveries. And you know, everybody knows the story of Columbus, Christopher Columbus, the Italian Jew, who made a proposal to Isabella of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, that they could perhaps, if the world is a sphere, not perhaps, since the world is a sphere, they could travel directly west and still reach to the east. Columbus had made certain kinds of calculations, very many of them wrong calculations. There were correct calculations about the circumference of the earth, but he didn't follow that. Had he taken that serious, he probably would not have attempted to make the trip. But he had radically different calculation that suggested that the circumference was not as large as it is, about 24,000 miles. So he decided to head, he suggested that he could head east. So he could head west and reach east. And his trips were funded. He made 4 voyages to the New World. He discovered the Americas for Europeans. And he was able to identify a source, not of the wealth that they wanted from India. From India, they were hoping to get spices and peppers and things like that for the preservation of meat for the winter. That was one of the most valuable things about the trade with India. One of the prospects of trade with India was to provide them with commodities that were necessary for the preservation of food. The New World provided them with an alternative. They found territory that they could actually take over. And one of the interesting things about the Spanish enterprise was that they, for the first time in Western Europe, began to establish their presence in alien lands, planting their flag in places like Guanahani or Watling Island, and on the coast of all the territories that they came into contact with: Hispaniola, Central America, South America. They now were creating an empire. So we find the birth of Western European imperialism, an imperialism that continued up to the 20th century. I mean, it continued up to the time when we became independent. So this was a very significant development that took place. The notion of the earth had radically changed. It was a much larger space now. The earth was no longer a few lands around the Mediterranean Sea, right? The Mediterranean Sea no longer seemed to be the center of the earth, right? Now the Atlantic Ocean was discovered. By the time Magellan made the trip around the world, down through the Cape of, not the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape Horn, right? Along the tip of South America, and he headed into the Pacific Ocean, right? For the first time, Europeans sailed into a body of water that was so many times larger than anything that they were accustomed to or could have expected. I mean, the Pacific Ocean is about 10 or 11, if not more, yes, about 10 or 11 time zones, right? From west to east. So the discoveries that were made revealed a world much larger than anybody had conceived before. And that in itself radically altered the worldview that was the dominant Judeo-Christian worldview at the time. Right? Remember that in the days of early Christianity, Paul wanted to reach Spain because Spain was the end of the world. And Thomas had gone as far as India, and that was another end of the world. And then there was Philip in Ethiopia. That was another end of the world. People were just spreading out to these various geographical points to make sure that they covered the entire earth. Now, for the first time, they discovered that the earth was many, many times larger. than they could ever have conceptualized. Right, so the age of discovery was a very significant development and had radical implications for altering Western civilization thereafter. And then there was the Reformation, and the Reformation also shook the foundations of Christianity, right? There's no need to go into the story of Martin Luther and so on, because theology students are well acquainted with those stories, but you know what happened. The story of Luther, his 95 theses on the church, his challenge to the authorities, the support that he got from the German princes, right? The fact that the papacy was not able to crush him as they would have done so many people who had attempted reform before, people like Huss and Jerome and so on, in earlier periods. They had challenged the church also, and they were put before the Inquisition and killed. But now, for the first time, a man was able to challenge the authority of the Pope in the Western Empire and remain untouched. And that led to the rise of a number of new churches, all of these churches coming out of the Roman Catholic Church. But that was a horrible event in Western history, because it didn't make for necessary for greater religious freedom and so on. What it led to was decades of bloody warfare, right? The wars of religion were fought, the 30 Years' War, the wars of religion were fought. And many of these emergent churches were as tyrannical as dictatorial, right? And as intolerant as the Roman Catholic Church. For example, the Calvinists in Geneva, right? They had established the authority there, and nobody could challenge it, right? If you wanted to survive. So the Reformation, right, radically changed relationships among European nations. Now, the Western Europe was now split between a Southern Europe that remained within the domain of Catholicism, and Northern Europe, Germanic Europe. So there was a conflict between Latin Europe and Germanic Europe. Germanic Europe now becoming Protestant. Places like England and the Netherlands and so on, many of the Northern European countries, they were countries France was split in half, right? So you had Huguenots, who were Protestants in the north fighting against the Catholics in the south. Bloody period of human history. The Catholics underwent a reformation themselves. The church had its own reformation with the rise of the Jesuits and so on. And that is referred to as a counter-reformation. So many of the charges that were laid against the church by the early reformers were charges that were rectified by the church with the counter-reformation. However, it didn't lead to a compromise or reconciliation between them, because what was happening was that very many of the it didn't lead to a reconciliation between them, because they still maintained there was a lot of political involvement. That one of the things about the Reformation, that it gave a greater degree of political independence to the Germanic peoples in the north, and independence from the sway of the church, and independence from the power of the central clerics, and certainly an independence from the domination of the papacy. And finally, in terms of the historical background, the technological developments of this period were remarkable. A lot of the technology, and this is important for our period, because people always charge China for not recognizing the property rights of people. They take your machines, they dismantle it now, and they reproduce it, sometimes reproduce it in a superior way. The Japanese have been doing that for quite some time also. But really, when the Renaissance period took place, a lot of Chinese technology was responsible for the radical progress that Western Europeans had made. Western Europeans have been able to get paper. They didn't know how to make paper before. The Chinese were making paper for over 1,000 years. And now they were able to get the secret of the technology of paper making, and paper could be made. Not only could paper be made, but the printing press was invented. And the printing press was invented based on models from China. Chinese had been using a press, a printing press before. And then there was a compass that also came from China. Now the compass, without the compass, Columbus could not have been able to make his 4 voyages to the New World. One of the interesting things about Columbus's voyage, and that is what makes Columbus's achievement such a magnificent achievement. He was not the first man to sail the Atlantic at all. The Vikings had been sailing the Atlantic long before, and they had lived in places like Norway and going across to places like Newfoundland in North America. Africans seem to have been sailing right along the equatorial belt. Africans seem to have been sailing to the New World. When Columbus came on his voyages to the New World, he had some Africans with him, and people said that the natives said they saw people like them before. But the problem is that without the compass, they couldn't go back home, couldn't find their way back home. Columbus can leave the port of Seville in Spain and return right back to that port. And one has to remember that when people were traveling in the old days, you looked at the stars. Stars guided you. But when you went into an unfamiliar region that which was not charted, then you had no way of finding your way back, right, from the place of origin. And now with the compass, you could actually find your way back home. So these were significant developments. And then there was gunpowder. What is significant about European navigation is that it led to the rise of European imperialism. But that imperialism would have been impossible without a superior weapon to conquer native peoples. And the gunpowder also came from China. So there are a number of Chinese inventions that Europeans have been able to steal and appropriate and utilize these inventions to gain the tremendous ascendancy that they gained during that period. So that provides us with an idea as to what were the historical developments, the significant historical developments that took place in Western Europe, and that explains why the age of antiquity and the age of the medieval thinkers and monks and so on must have come to an end. Western scholasticism during that medieval period must have come to an end. People had a radically new experience of the world, and that would certainly generate new developments in European thought. And so that provides you with a kind of understanding of the historical background. What I want to do now is to talk about the man who very often is regarded as the father of modern philosophy. He's a man who really was responsible for making that radical break with the medieval scholastic philosophies and devised a new way of seeking knowledge, of understanding the world, and laid the foundation for almost all aspects of modern philosophy. And his name is René Descartes, R-E-N-E-D-E-S-C-A-R-T-E-S. The adjective from Descartes is Cartesian, so very often you may hear me referring to a Cartesian notion or Cartesian development. René Descartes was the father of modern philosophy. And René Descartes decided that first philosophy really is that, in other words, you have to begin philosophy. When he says first philosophy, it really means that this is how you begin philosophy. So first philosophy really is epistemology. One has to determine how one arrives at a certainty about one's understanding of the real world. How do you arrive at that certainty? Remember, with the ancient Greeks, ontology was what initiated Greek philosophical thinking. What does the world consist of? But Descartes is saying even before you consider the stuff that the world is made of. You have to determine how can you get to know about that stuff. Is the mind capable of finding, of discovering, of understanding, right? Of having a correct conception of the world in which we live. And so Descartes said that first philosophy essentially is epistemology. And to a large extent, epistemology has become the dominant orientation of almost all Western philosophies after Descartes. Yes, ontology has not been forgotten. People still talk in terms of the nature of being, right? But epistemology, that epistemological turn in philosophical thinking that it was initiated by Descartes is something that continues to define Western philosophical inquiry and discourse up to the present time. Descartes was a tremendous thinker. Very interesting biography. I will not go into the biography in any detail, but he was a very independent thinker. He was French. But again, as I hinted before, he chose to live in Amsterdam because his views were so radical and so very different and challenged all the views before, certainly in the area of philosophy, that it would have been unsafe to live in any other part of the world. It would certainly have been unsafe in France or even Britain, perhaps, although England was also quite a tolerant country compared to many of the others. It would have been dangerous to live in Italy or Spain or any of these other countries. So he chose to live in Amsterdam. But he was a French writer. He wrote most of his works in Latin and so on, but he certainly was a Frenchman. And he also wrote, a lot of his works in French and provided for the French language, some kind of philosophical quality. Right now, you could now articulate and write your treatises in French and know that you could communicate your ideas quite effectively. Made a tremendous contribution to the development of the French language as a philosophical tool. He was a superb mathematician, and mathematics became the model for his philosophical investigations, right? And again, that in a way you can go right back to Plato to identify that and even before Plato, to Pythagoras, to identify that central position that mathematics seems always to have held in very many philosophical systems. He himself was a great mathematician and created, he invented coordinate geometry. The analytical method that was developed in that early period was essentially the work of René Descartes. Right? He was one of the first men to apply algebra to geometrical problems. Algebra was a mathematical tool that had been invented by Muslim mathematicians. And now the Europeans were learning it. They got the number system from the Arabs, right? And they still call it Arabic numerals, but the Arabs had got it from the Indians, right? 0 to 9, that series of numerals were invented by Indians. And it was the Arabs that brought it to the West. And the Europeans adopted that mathematical system from the Arabs. And the Arabs invented algebra. So algebra now became a very important tool and algebra is central in mathematics. But algebra is a science which deals with unknown quantities, but it provides you with formulas to discover the unknown element. So he himself was a famous mathematician and made a tremendous contribution to the growth of mathematics, right? But his greatest contribution really was in the area of knowledge, of philosophy. And so he wrote a number of books, but there are two very famous books that he wrote, right? His Discourse and Method and his Meditations and First Philosophy. His Discourse and Method, I think I indicated in the chart, the reading chart that I gave in your notes, that you should take a look at a little part of his book 1, in the Discourse of Method, right? he was trying to develop a methodical approach, right, an analytical approach in order to determine what is the foundation on which we can build our philosophical inquiries, our search for knowledge. And what he claimed was that all we have is the use of reason. Reason is what God has given us. That inner light of reason is what God has given us in order to identify what is true and what is error. Now, that was a radical step that he had taken, because one of the achievements of medieval philosophy was the reconciliation of reason and faith. Remember, from as early as St. Augustine, and later on with Anselm, and then with Aquinas, there was that massive reconciliation of faith and reason. And Aquinas had provided philosophers in the Middle Ages with the correct approach to in the search for knowledge, and that is that faith, right, must lead reason, right? Faith must lead reason. You begin from a position of faith, and then you rationalize. Descartes would have nothing to do with that. He could not see the possibility of that reconciliation. Remember, Tertullian didn't see that possibility either, an early Christian theologian. He said there's no reconciliation between faith and reason. There's no way in which Athens and Jerusalem can come together, right? So there had always been that anti-rationalistic trend among a number of medieval theologians, but the great philosophers of the Middle Ages claimed that they achieved that reconciliation. That ended with Descartes. And after Descartes, there was no attempt, well, besides what was happening within the Catholic Church and what was happening with perhaps Christian thinkers within the church, working within the confines of the church, they still held on, right, to that need for the reconciliation. We talk about it as a synthesis of faith and knowledge, right? But philosophers from henceforth felt that it was not safe to attempt that reconciliation, because faith comes with a number of presuppositions that are not examined, right? You come to the area of knowledge with a number of faith-based presuppositions that are not examined, and that is really a dishonest way of doing philosophy. If philosophy is serious about itself, it must start from the very base. And so that is what he attempted to do. And what he did was to invent a method that he referred to as systematic doubt. If you want to arrive at the ground on which you can build knowledge, then you have to use the methodology of systematic doubt. Now, systematic doubt is like skepticism, but it is only a tool. It is not a philosophical position that you are taking, right? Denying the possibility of knowledge. You're using doubt as a tool in order to arrive at a base for the reconstruction of knowledge. And so he says, we can't depend on our senses. No, we cannot depend on our senses, because, and he's a man who came with the notion of the dream. When we are dreaming, we are sure that we are in the real world very often. We see things, we touch things, we have feelings, you have experiences, we see people that we know, and so on. And then we wake eventually only to discover that all of that was an illusion. It could well be that our experiences in the real world are also illusionary, that they are not real. And therefore, there's a possibility of doubting everything. In addition to that, the senses deceive us in so many ways. We look at a stick, right, in a pool of water. The pool is disturbed, and the stick behaves as a snake. And you know that the stick has not changed shape. It remains straight, but it begins to wiggle as the water is disturbed. That is an illusion, right? We see a number of illusions, and anybody who studies psychology would know, about all kinds of other illusions that people experience. So hallucinations and so on. So there's a sense in which you cannot depend on your senses. And it may well be that the world is ruled by an evil demon who is here just to deceive us. But he uses an argument that he finds in Augustine. Right? In book 11 of Augustine, Augustine merely in a passing comment talks about the fact that when I doubt, there's one thing that I'm sure about, and that is I am alive. I am doubting. You can doubt everything around you, but you can't doubt that you're doubting. Augustine uses an argument, and just in about 3 or 4 pages in book 11 of the City of God, he presents that. Descartes takes that and builds his whole philosophy on that. And Descartes says, if I'm therefore doubting, and that doubting, that experience of doubting, could provide me the assurance that I am, then clearly I have a basis for reconstructing knowledge. And so, using my rational faculties, I can conclude that if I think, I doubt, I think, cogito in Latin, if I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. That must be perhaps the most famous word, those are perhaps the most famous words in all philosophy, certainly on modern philosophy. Cogito ergo sum. I think, cogito ergo, therefore, sum, I am. I think, therefore, I am. And when he discovers that, he says that self-certainty is the foundation of knowledge. I know that I exist. And he's able now to use that concept of the cogito, and he's able to reconstruct the whole spectrum of knowledge. He says, because if I'm sure that I exist, then I'm also sure that God exists. Now, one of the interesting things about many of these early rationalistic philosophers is that they have departed from the scholastic modality of inquiry and discussion, but they are sincere Christians. Some of them are not, and we'll identify those who are and those who are not. But Descartes is a devout Catholic, right? And Descartes is certainly not prepared to dismiss the fundamental doctrines of the church and to reject these doctrines. But Descartes says, if I am sure that I exist, then I'll use my rational faculties, and I'm also sure that God exists. And how do I arrive at that? Simply because I didn't make myself. If I'm here and I didn't produce myself, then there must have been a being who produced me, and that being is God. And if that being is God, I must assume that that being is a good being. He's not an evil demon who is trying to deceive me and give me the impression that there's a world when there really is no world. He has to be a good being. And if God is a good being, then he's not deceiving me about the reality of the world. And so from the notion of God and God's ultimate goodness and absolute goodness, then again using the rational tools that he has, he's able to arrive at an understanding of the reality of nature, of the real world in which he lives, of other people in that real world. But the foundation for all of that knowledge is really the cogito, the fact that he is, because he experiences thought. In terms of God, he accepts Anselm's ontological argument, and that's very interesting, right? The ontological argument, as you remember, is an argument that Anselm had devised. That fellow was not comfortable with it. Aquinas was not comfortable with it. He rejected it basically and came up with his own 5 proofs of God's existence. But Descartes accepts that argument. And Descartes argues, like Anselm, that if God is the most perfect being who exists, then existence must be an attribute of that being. Now, that is something eventually, when we come to Immanuel Kant, he was totally rejected. But up to that point, it was difficult to reject the concept. The most perfect being must also have existence. You can't be just a concept in the mind of man. Then he would not be the most perfect being if he lacks existence. And so he comes up with the ontological argument. He revises the ontological argument outside the context of Christian theology. Now, as a purely philosophical principle, as an argument to validate the existence of God. And he also has the cosmological argument, the argument of the creation of the universe. The universe did not self-create. The universe is here. We are sure about its existence. And we know that it is a universe that is real. It is a universe that God has given us in his goodness and his love, that in which our needs are provided for and so on. And therefore, there must be a God who would have created such a universe. He also maintains in an even far more rigorous way the traditional Christian notion of the duality of body and soul. Right? Remember that Christianity had adopted that Platonic notion that soul and body are separate substances, and that soul survives body, so that when you die, your soul goes somewhere. And in the Catholic system, it was a very complex kind of post-life reality. You could either go to heaven if you were a good person, or you could go to hell, or if you were not too bad and you didn't deserve to be condemned to perpetual suffering in hell, then you could go to purgatory and spend a number of years there until you were purged and therefore prepared for heaven. And there was also even another place called limbo for unbaptized children and so on. Very complex reality, but the soul survived the body. The soul could not be extinguished. The soul could not perish. That was a basic Neoplatonic idea that infiltrated Christianity. And not only were Catholics dualists, ontological dualists, but almost every one of the Reformed churches that came out of the Catholic Church in the Reformation, Lutherans, the Calvinists, and so on, adopted that ontological dualism that characterized Christian theology. Descartes was a radical dualist, and he believed there was a radical separation between mind and matter. That mind, which he called the thinking thing. Yes, there was a slight break here. Well, the res cogitans, right? The thinking thing, that is the mind, and opposed to the mind and having no real direct relationship with it was res extensa, or the thing that is extended, the thing that is outside of the mind, extension, the material world. So he radically separates the two of them. And he does not see one as necessarily interrelating with the other. They are just two parallel systems that coexist, right, within the individual, coexist in the natural world, but there really is no relationship between them. So thoughts are thoughts, and human actions and behaviors, physical actions and behavior, are physical actions and behavior. And you may find that there is some kind of relationship between them, but in truth and in fact, they are merely two parallel systems that are running alongside each other. A strange notion. Descartes also talked about innate ideas. We have innate ideas. And when he talked about innate ideas, it is not the same innate ideas that Plato talks about. Remember, in the case of the Platonic metaphysics, people have innate ideas, but these are ideas that come from a previous life through recollection. Many of the ideas are not ideas that came from outside of us. We didn't get them by our observation of the natural world, nor did we invent them. We just found ourselves with them. Like the idea of God, for example, is an innate idea. You just accept that there's a God, but you don't necessarily have to find an external correlate to substantiate or validate that view. And so the notion of innate ideas with Descartes, however, is not Platonic. It is just that given the nature of mind and the reason, the light of reason that God gives us, we can generate innate ideas. And so we have three kinds of ideas, he says. We have ideas that we invent, We create them. We have ideas that we get from outside, from observation of the natural world, but we also have innate ideas which are very, very fundamental, very foundational. And so Descartes, the Cartesian psychology is a psychology which seeks to articulate ideas and so on in a very clear and distinct manner. Remember, I said earlier that mathematics is the model that he uses for the attainment of truth. The search for truth must follow a certain kind of mathematical rigor. And so when you're expressing ideas, he says ideas must be expressed very simply. You begin with the expression of clear, simple ideas, and then you begin to develop your complex and convoluted systems based essentially on that. And that is very important, very interesting, because it came to be very characteristic of French intellectual culture. To a large extent, French intellectual culture seeks to articulate its notions and its ideas with clear and distinct ideas. Le mot juste, for those of you who know French, the precise word, le mot juste, the precise word, is what the Frenchmen always try to capture as they explain or articulate something or make something intelligible. And so Descartes put his stamp on the whole of French intellectual culture and in the way in which they use language. Finally, the Cartesian contribution to philosophy has largely been a contribution to what has been called a philosophy of the subject. It is Descartes that makes the subject important. I think, therefore I am. It is that self that is central in the whole philosophical enterprise. If the self is central, subjectivity is central, selfhood is central, then the individual is so very important. And there's a sense in which this individualistic age that we call our modern age, individual is all that is of importance, right? And the individual and his agency and his capacity for freedom and autonomy and so on. That individual, right? That philosophy that celebrates the individual goes right back to Descartes' philosophy. Essentially, I think we've chatted sufficiently for the evening. And the next day, we are going to look at two other rationalistic philosophers who took their cue from Descartes and who made a tremendous contribution to laying the foundation for European rationalism. The next development would be British empiricism, but I will come to that in a subsequent